All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm here today to speak about hooks, and probably we're just gonna talk who I am and what I do. Well, my passion is around engineering plus design. I'm an engineer, but I'm really passionate about combining design and bringing it up to the engineering. So I'm a strong believer that design should come first and then the engineering solutions. And I currently work at the company called Resume.io, and I feel like this event is really special for me because the company is actually Dutch, although I'm not based in the Netherlands. So I'm glad to be here. It's super cool to be here tonight. We just 3 years old, but we have 4 million resumes online. And we're growing pretty fast. So you can find me online on Twitter at MLFearG or at GitHub Molfrog. So you can reach me out there. Okay, so again, about design, I feel like this is really a special topic for me because my wife and my wife is an architect. So what we do in our free time, so we tend to look for interesting buildings all around the world and visit them. Because we really enjoy the constructivism or some minimalism or functionalism. And what's here today on the screen is this library called Viipuri library by a Finnish architect Alvar Aalto. And this library was built in 1930s. And what's interesting about it is this library this is actually a monument for the functionalism. And what functionalism states is that your building has a function to serve. So you don't build building because it just looks cool. You build building because you need something for people to use it, right? And in this particular library, the architect, he invented this system of the natural lighting. So as you can see here, this is the main hall of the library, and they don't have any artificial lights. They only use holes in the ceiling. And the form of these holes, such as that it's really convenient to read a book or just enjoy the atmosphere. So it's always a good light for reading. Another interesting thing is that there is also a speaking hall, and it's built that the form of the ceiling allows you to better speak. So it's has a really nice audio in there. And Alvar Aalto believed that the mission of an architect is to take fundamental materials such as light, air, or just building materials and turn them into a building. And it has to be with the harmony of our life. So it doesn't have to be completely separated from what we do. It has to be a union of nature resources in our lives. So I really think that this is the right way to build stuff. So the function of the building, like in this library, it's just a fulfillment of those elements. But let's get back to React, right? We're here today to touch a little bit of hooks, and hooks were introduced around a year ago. And they are considered to be like a building blocks of an interface logic. So fundamental elements that you take, you combine, and then you have an interface, right? So probably the most fundamental hook is useState, and you probably have heard of it. And it's older browser useReducer. And basically what it does, it allows you to subscribe on a primitive value changes, right? So you have one value, whenever it changes, the component just renders. So pretty simple. But what's cool about hooks is that they're composable. So they have this semantics that you can use everywhere. You can actually implement different behaviors, but the interface will stay the same. And so here in the picture, you can see that we have useState, but you also can implement some more complicated behaviors like global state that is shared across the components of the app, or local storage state. But the semantics is just the same. So I actually have a demo for you here. Let's see if it works. Okay. So so this is like a simple component that changes its state when I click on it, and I can actually have a grid of components, right? And when I click on one, we notice that it's just all separated states. It's not a single one. But I can actually replace the same logic with a different hook, and then get behavior like this. Or, for example, I can get even more complicated and tricky behavior like this one, like the state that is delayed. Like it is shared across components, but it also has some time, like delay in time. So yeah, let's get back to the slides. So what we're going to do today, we're going to look at the hooks in action, and we're going to build a fully functioning router for React. Why not? And it's going to be a real open source project that we're going to release by the end of this talk. And yeah, let's start looking at it. And before we start talking about hooks and like routing, let's just think about how routing in React was done historically. So probably you have you knew that like routing has changed over time. There was no just one single way of doing routing in React. And for example, this de facto library called React Router, you're all familiar with it. This library actually changed its API multiple times. And in the beginning, they had this way of describing routes as configuration. So basically, and I think that came from a backend development where you have one file where you describe all the routes of your app. And yeah, you just change in one place, you know what your app does, and that's quite handy. And but eventually, they realized that the UIs are, I think, a little bit more complicated than backend, right? So they decided that, well, we can introduce configs, but actually the applications can be different. They can have different sorts of navigation, sidebars, whatever. So they decided that they will just simplify an interface and turn it into something like this. So let's just take a simple component that takes a route string and renders or doesn't render some particular component. Okay, simple. And I think they did a pretty nice job by like introducing fewer constraints here, and by that they actually gave more freedom for developers. In the beginning, it wasn't super clear how to use it, but then people actually understood that, well, this is actually super powerful. We can use more out of router with that. And we're going to start probably with implementing our router with a simple core. I personally don't like to start with like big things. I like to split it into smaller things first. And we're going to start with the core. So when you think about routing in your apps, like basically, it's just a way to do something based on the current location in the browser tab, right? And we have this property called location.pathname, which is a standard. And a router is just an object that listens to it, and whenever it changes, it does some logic, right? It just re-renders the app and shows a page that is needed to be on the screen. But this sounds really similar, right? This is actually similar to what we talked in the beginning of the talk. This is like a hook semantics, right? When you subscribe on something, then you react. Okay. So this is probably we can actually do the same thing. So let's introduce a hook called useLocation, and it will return a pair of values, a current location, and a setter for updating the current location, for navigating, actually. So same semantics. And how do we actually implement this? Well, let's just start from the top. And in order for it to re-render on changes, we have to use state, right? Because if you don't use state, the component will not be re-rendered. And so we introduce a state, and then we somehow subscribe and then update the state whenever location path name changes. And then we return this location back to our users. And we also provide a function that allows us to set a location with history push state, which is a standard API for doing ASPA navigation. All right, so how do we actually subscribe on changes? Well, in order to do that, we can use a hook called useEffect, and which is basically a thing that allows you to do something on mount and do something on unmount, basically. But it's more complicated, but basically this thing just allows you to subscribe to something in the component. But notice there's a second parameter here, which is a empty array. And the pro tip of hooks, always specify dependencies in useEffect and some other hooks. We'll get back to it, but just please remember that we have to specify an empty array here. It will be clear soon. All right, so this is the second hook from our list, and it's just a way to use subscriptions in components. And another function is it is basically a replacement for lifecycle hooks in functional components. Excuse me. Yes, so, but the thing is, we still have to subscribe on push state or replace state, which are the standard methods for navigation. And how do we do that? Unfortunately, there is no clear way to subscribe. There is no browser API for that. So you have two options. First one is you just monkey patch these methods. Doesn't sound pretty nice, but okay, that's an option. Second way is to actually intercept click on links. I know projects that use second approach, but I personally, I prefer to just pick the first one, which is easier, and I think I saw it somewhere, so let's just go with the first one. But it actually doesn't matter what we choose, but the thing is, at this stage, you probably, you already have a code, so you need to ensure that it doesn't break if you change the implementation of that. And yeah, maybe we can just wrap it in a component somehow, and you actually don't have to do that boilerplate. There is an existing library that allows you to do that. So React hooks testing library, just use that. You have methods for unmounting. You have a result. You can check, assert. Pretty convenient. All right, but how do we, now that we have a way to subscribe on URL changes, how do we actually do some pattern-based routing? And stuff like that. Like, what if you want to have some dynamic segments in your app? What if you want to have an ID of a user, which can be an arbitrary string? And yeah, so basically, the semantics of this is that we need something that returns a Boolean value and the array, like a hash of parameters. So this is just the design of this thing, right? So I need two things. First of all, I need a way to know if there was a match or not. And second of all, I need to somehow extract dynamic segment out of the URL, right? So this is how this could look, and eventually we can come up with a hook called useRoute. Why not? So let's actually implement this hook. And in order to do that, we can actually we don't have to write this logic from scratch. We can just use an existing solution. There is a library called path2regex with a long history. It powers libraries like Express and React routers. So just take it, and it allows you to transform dynamic segments into regular expression. Cool. Now that we have some way to use routing, how do we actually, this doesn't look really convenient, right? Like if we want to use some simple app with 3 pages, we can use this hook, but we also need to check if there was a match or not, return null, and then proceed. So this results in boilerplate, and we actually need some maybe more declarative way to do that. Let's design a component that allows you to do that, and we'll just copy the React routers one, the component that takes a string with a pattern and a component to render. Let's actually implement this now, and yeah, we just use the same thing. I will just want to outline that at the bottom of this code there is a method h, which is basically a create element in React. It allows you to add new props to basically construct a component, treat it as a vanilla JS6. Cool. So how do we actually now navigate? We now have a route, we have use location, we have use route, but we need some way for users to actually go back and forth pages. So we can introduce some component called link. And if we decide to implement link, we basically can just use location inside. We can use second parameter, which allows us to set the URL. And we just pass an additional, a customized on-click handler. And I would like to just outline that here I use the new hook called useCallback, and which is not needed, but it's a good it's a good tip to use it because this opens some doors to further optimizations into your app. So the semantics of this method is pretty much similar to useEffect, except that what it does, it caches the function that you provide based on some dependencies. Okay, so the third hook from the list, it basically uses to describe computed values that depend on other values. And here, I just wanted to show a diagram because when you're just starting out with hooks, you might actually, this is not really obvious when what arguments should you use, and use this diagram. And if you don't specify dependencies, like you just forget to add an array in use callback or use effect, in this case, just remember that the value will be always stale. So it will be recomputed all the time, so it's not really optimized. So don't forget to pass an empty array if you want a value to be computed just once. But if you pass like some dependencies, the value will be recomputed only when one of the dependencies changes. Cool, but we also need some way to have, we need some development experience, right? We need for our developers to have multiple ways to specify a link. What if I want to have a class name, or what if I want to have my own link component? So we can design these 3 forms of using a link. And in order to implement this, you can actually use clone element, which is from the React package. Use clone element, and it allows you to take an existing element and append some props and override them. This is really efficient, so don't worry about the optimizations. It will be okay. All right, so finally, we need some way to have an exclusive routing. And by that, I mean, what if you have multiple pages, but they have overlapping conditions? Like what if you want to have also a default fallback route, which is rendered when nothing matches, right? And it works like that. You have we have first route in the list. We wrap it with switch, and switch always guarantees that the first matched route is rendered. So in this case, user/all first match, user/some number ID second match, and also path to regex allows you to have these dynamic segments, like default segments, sort of say, where the parameter can consist of multiple slashes inside. So, which is quite handy for default routing. Okay, so I'm not going to show how switch is implemented, except that we'll just go through the basic structure. Basically, what you need is take children, iterate over them, see if it matches, and just render it. But also don't forget about use this isValid element. Quite handy if you need to filter out things like strings, basically no components. And this pretty much mimics the implementation of switch from React Router. Cool. Now there is a problem. The problem is our router is 2.2 kilobytes already, but we just don't have any functionality. It's pretty simple. So why so? And the reason is because path to regex consumes around 65% of the library. Well, in normal situation, I would say okay, let's forget about it and just use path to regex. But I decided to go a little bit further, and I thought, well, do I actually need all the functionality that path to regex provides? Because, well, yes, it obviously powers Express, and Express has all this different scenarios, but I don't need it. I just need some way for people to use it, right? I need some most common scenarios that people will face while they building interfaces, right? Their apps. And basically, the path to regex can be case sensitive, case insensitive. It can match part of the string. We don't need that. Let's just think that it's all case insensitive. It always matches the entire string. Now, path to regex also has type parameters. Well, let's just leave it to users. Let them see if it's really a string or a number or not. So we don't need that. We can just throw it away. And also they have nameless parameters. Yeah, we probably don't need that because we can have modifiers like asterisks, like we saw on the slide with switch. Okay, so long story short, I spent a night looking at how what path to regex generates. I did some reverse engineering. I ended up with some really complicated regular expressions, but I was able to shrink it down to 1 kilobyte. Cool. Yes. You can see you can check out the issue if you're interested how it's implemented. But anyway, another thing is if you're building libraries like I do, or even if you're just working on some projects and if you care about speed and the size of your package, I think the good rule of thumb is always like keep an eye on like how fat is your library. And in order to do that, there is a tool called size limit, which is basically a thing that you include in package.json. You specify some limits, some constraints, and this thing always checks that your library meets the constraints. So pretty nice one. I all encourage you to check it out after the talk. Cool. But the problem now is, what if some people, because we already have running product, right? We already launched an MVP. What if there are still some like existing customers that who are using the matcher? And anyway, it would be nice to have some kind of a backwards compatibility with the regional path regex matcher. And we can probably introduce that by designing some sort of like top-level router component. So our developers can just use and pass custom matchers to it. And if they do, then this matcher is used instead of the default one. But also, let's just agree that this thing should be optional, right? It shouldn't be always in there, because who likes routers top level now? So let's just keep it for only advanced users. Now, how do we actually implement this? And the answer is, well, we can just pass it as a context, but we also need to ensure that the router we're building, so we need some way to some internal objects where we keep all settings. We also need to ensure that this thing doesn't change between renders. What if the entire app mounts and unmounts and mounts again? We need to ensure that it only when it updates, only constructed ones. So in order to do that, we can just introduce some kind of a temp state in this router component. And in order to do that, we can use useRef hook. So the useRef hook is just a thing that allows you to keep some values between renders. And it has current property. You can assign it. You can use it between renders. Pretty nice. Yeah, so this is the fourth hook from the list. And basically just a replacement for this attribute. Now we need some way to access the router and the settings from any arbitrary component, like from any other hook. How do we do that? Well, we can actually use context for that. And we can use the hook called useContext, yes. And what it does, it lets you take a value from the context and use it. And whenever it changes, the component just renders. Pretty similar to useState, except that it doesn't have a setter function. Now, so we here can write a hook called useRouter, uses context, and also take a look at the return value. There is one trick that allows us to have top-level router as an optional component. So what if we don't have it, and the context in this case null? So in this case, we always construct it when needed. But there is a problem with this implementation, and the problem is it's going to be constructed in every single hook that it's used in, and we don't want that. We always want to ensure that a router, like this router object, is constructed once. So, how do we do that? And wouldn't it be nice if we had some way to, have some kind of a ref, but which is not like component scoped, but app scoped. And in order to do that, there is a trick, another one, which I really love. And the trick is we can actually write a use global ref. And it will basically kind of look the same as useRef, but instead the reference will be shared across all the components of your app. And the only reason it works is because React context is cool. React context has this optional parameter that you can use when you construct context. And this value is used when nothing is provided. So if you don't wrap your app in provider, this value will be used. So this is kind of cool because we can use it, we can subscribe to this context and then use it as a global reference. Nice. So now we actually have a nice extension point. So what if we don't want to customize a matcher function, but we can actually customize the hook itself that powers the location. And this opens a door for other types of routing. What if we want to we can implement hash-based routing, or we can implement routing that is persisted across all the pages. And let's look at the demo here. So right here I have a real website powered by our router, simple navigation, couple of pages, and two default routes, right? And what if I actually what if we replace the default use location hook with a different one? So this is how it works by default, right? So think about this as two separate tabs in your browser. So we have same website, but just separate navigation. But what if you're building something that should be shared across tabs? What if you want the readers to, what if you're actually building a presentation that should be always synced on all devices that it's streamed on? So we can write a synced hook that syncs it with some delay, right? Cool. And notice that we didn't rewrite our app. We just changed one function. And that's, I think, one of the best, coolest features of hooks. They are composable, they have the same semantics, and they are really foundational. All right, let's get back to the slides. Now, the extra section here is supporting Preact. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to work on two markets, right? We're building a product, we're building an open source project, so why not? We need more audience. And Preact is a good opportunity, in my opinion, to target more customers, to attract new blood. How do we do that? The problem is we cannot just let our users import it from the same package because it should probably use Preact imports. By the way, Preact X, which is right now is a release candidate, has support for hooks, which is great. So the only thing we need is to just say that, well, if you use Preact, just use different exports. And we can do that by just providing, let's just take all React-related stuff and put it into a separate file. And we have this file different across implementations. But all of the rest will stay the same. And we'll just copy it on pre-publish. So this is more or less the structure of my project. And when I run pre-publish only script on NPM before publishing, it just copies all the sources to Preact folder. Good. And also, additional thing is, keep in mind that in Preact there are some differences. So you'll always have to check every single line of code that it doesn't break, that it is compatible with both Preact and React. And in my case, the only thing that was different is that in Preact, children is always an array, which is not the case in React. But can be fixed with this small one line of code. Nice. What did we get here during this talk? Well, first of all, we have met some hooks from the package. But there's just one hook left, right? And we didn't talk about it. And this is a bonus track. It's not, unfortunately, I couldn't just fit it into the router story because I just didn't know how to use it. So I will just show it anyway. The hook is called useImperativeHandle. In my opinion, this is the coolest one, but also the most dangerous one. So use it with precaution. Basically, it's a hook that allows you to do some imperative stuff with your components. And usually, you don't have to do that because you have state. So the good rule of thumb is always relying on state changes rather than ref manipulations. But there are still some cases when it's needed. And what if you have a component that renders a confetti on the screen and it just works with the canvas? I use this library called Canvas Confetti, right? It has an imperative API. It doesn't know anything about React. And I need some way to just trigger the confetti on the screen. So in this case, you wrap your component with forward ref so that you can get the ref. And you use useImperativeHandle in order to extend the reference. And then you define methods on it, and you can just run arbitrary imperative stuff on it. And we have a demo. Hope it works. Click. OK. On your command. OK. Boom. Yes, it worked. Fine. Yeah, I spent the entire morning implementing this, but I'm really proud of it. Cool. And another thing that we did today is we followed the journey of an open source library from the design till the final launch. And I think that this is really important because, like, if you don't have an open source projects, I think that's a great way to train yourself and know that you're not writing code because you just writing code. You're writing code because you want to fulfill someone's function. So keep it in mind, and always know that there are tricks that you can use from product approach. You can always run an MVP. You can always just fake some things, talk to your customers, stuff like that. So the project is real. You can go and start it. So hopefully you can reach 1,600 stars today, I hope. The name of the project is Wouter, which is, I think, super interesting because we are in the Netherlands, and Wouter is a real Dutch name. So I hope there are no Wouters in the audience, so no offense. But people like the name, so why not? And some play of words here. And finally, I'd like to mention that we always follow this top-down design principle. And I think this is really crucial when you design software. And this is where we can learn from architects that were active during the beginning of the last century or even earlier, that they knew how to do stuff that people use. So we actually use the same principle where form always goes after function. So keep in mind that functions first, know what you're building. And if you remember, with React router, they also followed this. So they started with the function. They decided to change the API, give more freedom by introducing less constraints, by using fundamental components. And in our case, I think in the React ecosystem, it's nicely done by hooks. So thanks a lot for the talk. And there is a project repo that you can fork. You can go and create an issue. You can actually use it in your project. You can follow me on Twitter or just ask any questions related to the talk. And I also wanted to say special thanks to Katya, who did such a nice illustrations for this talk. So she actually asked me to take a picture of me on stage with her illustrations. So if someone could do that, I would appreciate that, and just send me on Twitter. Cool, thanks. Yes, thank you for listening.